There's four horsemen swimming through Western Cum. What's up, guys? We are continuing our philosophy section. Last time I planned on doing this in just 2 videos, but I should have realized that it would take 3. We left off last week or yesterday when it comes to transcendence and immanence and the sort of perspectival vanishing point. So now we will continue. Quoting Gebser, "The about face or change into the opposite is thus no longer necessary." Opposite being transcendence and immanence. Man no longer needs to recoil from a limit of thought and revert to psychism, into the quote-unquote captivity of the soul, nor is he required to remain in the cul-de-sac of perspectival fixity. Rather, in him and in the world, an aperspectival vista or perception opens. Surely it is not fortuitous that Solazzi's notable demonstration includes the formulations of a quote-unquote more original time, of the relationships of transcendence to time, as well as fundamental assertions about spiritual being and being spirit. So we are heavily in the 4D integral consciousness stuff, and you can tell because we have spiritual stuff coming back. We have and the positing of a more original time. So not only is time, that should be a dead giveaway, but it's also a more original time. That, of course, is referencing origin. We are in the 4D world now. In addition, his statements accomplish an important further step. The supersession of the extreme secularity and anthropological barrenness, indeed wretchedness, of the exclusively existential position and quest. So if I do take on existentialism, it sure as hell isn't going to be this secular nonsense. Ignoring the divinity in man does not mean it doesn't exist. I don't know what to say. There could hardly be a clearer expression stating the rejection of the validity of rationalism, with its inherent dualism, and of the denunciation of rationalism as such than in the above examples. It is only natural that precisely in existentialism, the relationship of this not yet secured a rational position initially led to mostly quote-unquote negative results, to a kind of distress and anxious helplessness. This irrational position is a threat only if we fail to surmount the emptiness, abyss, and nothingness that are transiently attendant upon the rejection of every old position. Being in time expresses this precarious and ambiguous situation, which Sartre later intensified, yet is surmountable, and there are no indications that it is being superseded. So, a little microcosm of what's happening more broadly in that interval stage, in that time, or you're making that transition, there's going to be rough patches. And the rough patches is, yes, we've loosened the sort of bolts of rationalism, but what have we replaced it with? Existentialist nihilism and anxiety and nausea or whatever. That's not going to help the world. That's not going to... I mean, I'm not saying you can never talk about it, but if that's all you have to offer, this is deficient integral consciousness. These things need to become conscious. Okay. This brings us to 3. The turn toward the whole and diaphaneity in recent philosophy. It is expressed in the renunciation of the demand for conceptualization, an act which permits the mutation from the 3-dimensional mentality into 4-dimensional integrality of the whole. The traditional philosophy consequently becomes an etiology. So that's what Gebser is saying is replacing philosophy. Traditional mental philosophy is gone. We are in etiology. What is the difference between the two? Traditional mental philosophy is reliant pretty much exclusively on secular rationality, where etiology is not. It can be rational, but it also incorporates and integrates time, as well as space-time, and irrational stuff, of course. And spirituality, of course, that's a big part too. Where are we to find such aperspectival indications in philosophy? First, in Heidegger's changed position, and second, in certain results of E. Husserl's phenomenology. Besides Bergson, Husserl is undoubtedly the most decisive thinker of the preceding generation. I'm sure you philosophers might have something to say about that. That's a subjective claim. I don't know enough to affirm or deny that. There is going to be some praise for Heidegger in here, which I think is good, because it does show that Gebser is trying to be fair. The phenomenological philosophy founded by Husserl does not proceed from eidetic sciences, nor does it investigate contingent facts. It proceeds descriptively, and its essential object consists of the essential interconnections which are gradually envisaged via intuition. I made a mistake. I don't know in which series it was, but I didn't understand what phenomenology was. This is phenomenology, really, this irrational integral stuff. I thought it was just getting lost in the clouds. I think I decried it as rationalism. I made a big mistake. Don't do that. Phenomenology, it can be bullshit, obviously, but when done right, you get the ever-present origin, which is just this unbelievably profound stuff. And notice, essential object consists of essential interconnections. That's a direct connection to, no pun intended, to structure that is so important in all the other domains, particularly science, now with, of course, in philosophy with postmodernism, power, knowledge, structures. There you go. The emphasis is no longer on the categorical systems, but, without denying them, on the emergence of concerns characteristic of the essence of aperspectivity, to see not only through interconnections, but through the essential interconnections. Moreover, Husserl's term pure consciousness elevates Dilthey's vitalistic and magically underscored theory of lived experience to a certain transparency. Husserl's formation rests to a great extent on the notion of intentionality, which he adopted from Brentano. Actually, I'll expand at the end. In the second chapter of his Ideas of Pure Phenomenology and Phenomenological Philosophy, Husserl has laid out the, quote, general structures of pure consciousness. What does that sound like? It would seem that behind the dividing wall of phenomenological terminology, the same basic trend in philosophy becomes evident that we have discerned as being inherent in other disciplines. Our concept of systasis, which together with system makes syneresis possible, may be seen as a terminological transfer of the phenomenological notion of the illumination of essential interconnections. So what he's saying is that him and Husserl are doing pretty much the exact same thing. We're seeing through rationalism, we're seeing through irrationalism and pre-rationalism, and we're finding the invisible, irrational connections, the invisible, essential, phenomenological structures and connections, the interconnections and interdependencies. That is exactly what Gebser is doing. And he's saying Husserl is doing something very similar. So in phenomenology, it's about how things sort of appear descriptively, how they appear to your consciousness. You can go in different, if I appear as a tree, if I perceive the tree as a tree, well, why is it that I'm perceiving it? What is necessary in my consciousness for me to perceive that as a tree? Why am I not viewing that as a symbol immediately, like maybe the unperspectival world? Is the tree a tree only because of my present state? Is it the tree a tree only because I'm in a calm moment? If I was getting mugged and I was running and I saw the tree, would it be a tree or would it be something else? Why is it that I view it as a tree rationally, but all my ancient ancestors viewed it as just the world? They didn't really have a divided individualist concept of what a tree was. So that's kind of phenomenology. I won't pretend to be an expert on this stuff. But I mean, the illumination of essential interconnections. Does that not sound exactly what Gebser is doing? So no longer is it rationality. So now rationality is interconnected to a structure, which is to say it belongs to the quantifiably measurable, the consciously known. It's fundamental with space, objectified space, which leads to the birth of a corresponding subject, directionality, goal-driven orientation, triangular thought, all this stuff, all these essential interconnections. That's phenomenology done best. Heidegger, too, takes up the concept of quote-unquote pure consciousness introduced by his teacher, Husserl. And it is significant to note that Heidegger, who himself points to the limitations of mere representation or conceptualization, frequently speaks of the quote-unquote transparency of certain states of affairs and thoughts. To be sure, transparency for Heidegger is always related to ontology, but regardless of its intent, it is symptomatic that in his attempt to clarify being as a mode of realization, he speaks of emerging transparency and not of living, experiencing, and representing. Interesting. That's another point. So if you do living, you make the same mistake the existentialists made. You make the same mistake that the modern left makes when they appeal exclusively to lived experience. They are right in appealing to that. They're just wrong in appealing exclusively to that. It's the same way that the rationalists are right to appeal to rationality, just not exclusively, right? So I hate that he uses this guy's name so often. Sizzalasi? I hate that name. I want to go back in time and kill this guy, or just maybe give him a different name. That's probably the less. There's two extremes in that, but yeah, let's kill him. Actually, that'd be fun. Selassie also employs this new figure of speech when he notes that the limitation of man to only one possibility of being imperils that very being, a peril we can counter by, quote, making transparent the harmonious interconnections of forces of being as effectively lived power, unquote. Very important. Here, in transcendental philosophical terms, is an expression of our own attempt to clarify consciousness structurations. Thank you. Man is always placed into question if he sees only one possibility of being as his mode of realization and ascribes exclusiveness to only the magical, the mythical, or the mental structure. I'm not even going to expand on it. Only the diaphanous, quote-unquote, volition of all consciousness structures and the efficacious modes of being that they make possible allow that presentation, quote-unquote, of which Selassie speaks, in which the was and the will be vanish. There you go. The whole is at once. The was and the will be dissolve absolute presentiality. Oh, God, I hate the way he writes. Presentiality, that is, they dissolve time. So essentially, it's a fancy way, philosophical way of saying that the was and the will be dissolved because they are integrated into the present. Thank you to Gebser for illuminating this aspect. This diaphaneity, is further expressed in other statements of Heidegger, in what he defines as the quote-unquote dimension of truth and the quote-unquote luminescence of being, or when he speaks of the quote deconfined whole of openness, unquote, as being quote beyond numerical calculation, unquote, when he clarifies Rilke's statement regarding the sphere of being as quote being as a whole, and points out that this sphere of being and its sphericality we must never objectively conceptualize. I mean, there you go. There you go. The symbol, obviously, for the 40 integral structure is the sphere. The sphere is apparently, you just simply can't conceptualize it, which means its traditional rationality is gone. I mean, it's really beautiful the way Gebser connects this stuff. What emerges through the translucence of Heidegger's quote-unquote dimension of truth is, in philosophical terms, what we have called in terms of physics the fourth dimension, or in our circumlocution, the integral and integrating dimension. So essentially, this dimension of truth will necessarily, as long as it's connected to time, will necessarily integrate the material facts with the sort of invisible, immaterial, or amaterial aspect of the world, which, of course, I mean, as integral thinkers, we know this. His definition of truth as unhiddenness, expressed by the Greek word aletheia, is a first indication of this constellation. It is expressed even more clearly through his dissociation from the current mental rational interpretation of truth. Quote, the so-called critical concepts of truth, which since Descartes based truth on certainty, Descartes is the one that Gebser identifies as the beginning of the end in the sense of the beginning of rationalism. Since Descartes based truth on certainty, are mere variations on the assumed notion of truth as correctness. This familiar essence of truth, the correctness of representation, stands and falls on the basis of truth as unhiddenness of essence, unquote. Aside from the fact that the expression correctness of representation parallels our discussion of mentality, Heidegger further remarks that, quote, beyond the essence, yet not away from it, but proceeding from it, something else happens. An open region is present among the essence as a whole. It is a clearing, a luminescence. So we're going to talk about this for a second. So truth as aletheia is exactly how Heidegger and Gebser described it there. It's this idea that essentially the truth of something is dependent upon the question you put to it, because each new positing of a question in relation to the object under consideration reveals certain essence or certain essence of the object while also concealing some, right? So if I'm looking at a tree, I ask, does that tree produce sap? Right. Well, that's going to reveal, that question is going to reveal certain essence of that tree. So in that case, I'm going to be looking in the bare bones, if you will. I'm not going to be getting into symbolism. I'm not going to be getting into any of that. All of the symbolism, all of the even magical aspects to it, all of that has been concealed. But if I ask, is that tree tall enough for me to make a treehouse? Now new essence have been revealed while the old ones have been concealed. So my sap question that I posited first, all the essence related to that question in that direction have been concealed. But in doing so, we have new essence that are being unconcealed. So truth is this game of concealment and unconcealment. Every question unconceals certain essence while concealing all those other essence that are not really related to the direction of the question. I adopt this notion of truth, and you can see why correctedness, if you will, rational, traditional, mental truth, is dependent upon this. Because if you say, is it true that the tree is 10 feet long or 10 feet tall, we'll say, again, that's going to hide all those other symbolic essence. That's going to hide everything else. So all the correctness of representation is directly dependent upon the truth as aletheia. And I think, and I mean, Gebser doesn't point this out, but a connection I noticed is that, the functionality is very similar to how logic depends upon quantum logic, right? It's a sort of hidden, deeper realm that isn't really visible or representable, and yet we still know it exists because we have geniuses like Heidegger and Gebser. And it's interesting. Let's talk about the clearing for a second. So my understanding, and again, by the way, please, if you're a philosophy guy and you think I'm just way off, just let me know. I'd prefer if you're cool about it. You don't have to be. Just let me know. You're not going to offend me. I haven't gotten a ton of comments so far telling me that I've made a huge mistake, so I'm just assuming I'm doing okay, at least sufficiently. So the clearing is this sort of irrational faculty that's pre-embedded in the human, and it allows objects to appear at all. It is the light, if you will, of ontology. So think of let's say you're in the woods, which I think Heidegger lived in the woods, so he had a lot of analogies that were sort of wood related. So I'm walking through the woods, it's pitch black, can't see a goddamn thing. And then all of a sudden, I stumble and I see a clearing, which is to say a giant beacon of light or line of light has shone through, and I can see, there's bugs there, there's a tree there, there's my idiot friend John there, there's wood for a fire there. Things are becoming intelligible, right? So the clearing is the light that allows objects to become intelligible. Now take this principle and apply it to ontology. So I think what Heidegger's saying is different civilizations, different cultures have different lights, if you will. So in America and the West, our clearing, which is to say the ontological light we shine on objects that allow them to be perceptible through our rational faculties, is taking the object and putting it in this XYZ mental space and deriving its objective qualities, like in science. You know, it's a tree because it's 10 feet tall. It has all the scientific characteristics of a tree. That was obviously not always the case. I mean, there's a couple obvious examples. One, in ancient Greece, you had truth as aletheia. So, no, it had nothing to do with Vorhandenheit or XYZ Cartesian coordinates. It was just truth as aletheia. Or, more commonly, you had being as eidos, which is, I think, being as eidos was the Platonic ideals. Being as, what was the, oh, man. I can't remember, but essentially one of the clearing lights is the tree is a tree because God says it's a tree. So on one hand, we have this sort of rational, XYZ, scientific, that's a clearing. And then the other, like back in the day, we had in the Word of God. You know, the tree, like I said, the tree's a tree because God said so. And then we have being as phusis, which is this sort of aletheia idea. Pretty cool, I think, at least. This is irrational stuff. Rationality just can't do it. I don't know what to say. Okay, continuing. Does his luminescence of being tend toward what we have called the achronon, space-time freedom? There are indications of such possible kinship. For the luminescence is, quote, thought from the side of the essent, more being than essent. This open middle is not encompassed by the essence. Rather, the illumined midst itself, like the dimly known nothingness, encompasses all essence. Unquote. This ontological definition of the quote-unquote illumining midst as nothingness suggests our description of pre-temporal and pre-spatial efficacy, luminescence. Pretty cool. So essentially, hold on, let me try to reread that. Okay, so essentially illumining midst is the almost spiritual light, or I guess the light that derives from origin that renders the world transparent in its integral whole. Very similar to what Heidegger's doing with this luminescence of being. We're illuminating the fact that human beings their relationship to space and time is dependent on which structure they're viewing it from, right? Like, obviously, we had mythical 2D flat circle complementarity stuff that's way different from the mental stuff, the clock time. Quote-unquote luminescence can be terminologically transposed to describe the emergent consciousness of the space-time free middle, the clearing, which is perceptible only as space-time freedom. There you go. Okay, I want you to listen to this next sentence. Very rarely will I get on Gebser for writing in an obscure way, because he doesn't really do it that often. I wish he would be a little more clear on and just kind of flesh it out a little more, but that's whatever. Listen to this next sentence. I had my girlfriend read this sentence. Despite the formidable difficulties in relating the various ontological aspects with aperspectively realizable etiological veracities, so essentially is what he's saying is, despite the difficulties of kind of doing this non-consciously, connecting irrationality and the luminescence of being, as Gebser has here done, phrased in quite the way. It appears that the quote-unquote luminescence of being is already quote-unquote more than or different from mere philosophical definition of ontological aspects. It would seem to be etiological veracity. There you go. This is way beyond traditional rational stuff. All the more so, inasmuch as such veracity makes illusory the implicit antithesis between transcendence and immanence. For, quote, the luminescence into which the essence is situated is in itself at the same time concealment, unquote. Transcendence and immanence are only differing forms of the presence of clearing, or the achronon. Here the irrational and the rational are superseded by the inherent irrationality of the achronon. They become perceptible in transparency as a dimension of truth. So pretty much he's just describing what Gebser's doing. Again, this sort of four-dimensional, irrational luminescence of being, of rendering things transparent by not being caught in each one of the structures, standing outside the structures, understanding how they work, and taking that, applying it exclusively and say, hey, this works with reality, this distorts reality. There you go. Let's see. Okay. Heidegger also speaks of the luminescence or clearing as quote-unquote openness. Heidegger has written, quote, "In his invisible innermost heart, man is first inclined toward the loved, the ancestors, the dead, childhood, and those to come. This places it into its widest compass, which reveals itself as the sphere of presence of the whole, intact relationship. This presence, to be sure, like utilitarian consciousness and calculating activity, is one of immanence, yet the immanence of non-utilitarian consciousness remains in the inner space, which for all of us is beyond quantitative calculation and can freely overflow the limits into the whole, the open," unquote. These considerations lend to the sphere of being a transparency not attained by either Parmenides or Rilke. The imagistic mythical relation of Parmenides and the expressly magical confinement of Rilke, both of which have only potential transparency, are here surpassed. In his own way, Heidegger points to what we have called Rilke's magical attunement and interwovenness. Quote, "The sphere of being named here, i.e. of essence as a whole, is the openness as well as the closure of the limitless interflux and hence reciprocally effectual pure energy." So no longer, essentially what they're saying is, no longer are we confined to just the mental structure and just the patterns of interdependence between this structure, or the mythical or the magical. Now we have a sort of plentitude of irrational interconnections to make by recognizing that all these structures are simultaneously present and efficacious, which means you can find little tracings of each one of them, and there's a certain degree of openness that affords just this wealth of awesome connections that we can make. This is impossible under the rationalist stuff. Despite the complex and multi-leveled relationships of our entire state of affairs, the emergence of such quote-unquote concepts as non-utilitarian consciousness to complement the calculating, spatializing utilitarian consciousness is revealing, particularly as their emergence into consciousness, quote, opens the entire sphere of presence of whole, intact relationships. So beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Ready? Our non-utilitarian consciousness complement the calculating, spatializing, utilitarian consciousness. Please live your life that way. Stop dividing these and doing that. Let's see. This concept, perceiving the whole as a sphere of being, is definitely aperspectival. Perspectively, we can only see one side. Yep. The completeness of all aspects of being is is perceptible only aperspectively. With the sphere, the whole becomes transparent. Beautifully said. So, how is it possible that you could perceive the whole with traditional perspectival rationality? As Gebser just outlined, you cannot. You can only see one at a time. So, the integral aperspectival insight is to take that perspective, retain it, move, which is to say, when I'm moving to find a new perspective, there must necessarily be a temporal unfolding. So we have this perspective from, think of a Picasso painting, perfectly perfect. We have this perspective of the object that we're painting. Great. Take that, take the time to move and find a different perspective. Great. We have that. Take the time, and then you just repeat the process. So, the aperspectival man, my goodness, which is what we are able to perceive the whole because we are no longer static and forced to take one perspective and only one perspective. And it must be only one perspective according to the rationalists, because remember, everything is rendered static rationally. That is a problem. Or at least it's become a problem now. We are no longer confined by their static handcuffs. We, recognizing time and recognizing time's, strong association with movement, I don't see how anyone could deny that. We take the time to see all their perspectives and then combine them, in which none is really privileged over the other, but in doing so, we have rendered transparent the plenitude of irrational interconnections and the plenitude of being that exists. Pretty cool. Thus, through Heidegger, it may have become evident that certain characteristics of the integral consciousness structure, the aperspectival world, are also manifest in the most recent philosophies. So he does give credit to Heidegger, which is good, because his criticism a video or two ago, his criticism was terrible. Instead of conceptualization, it speaks of emergent transparency. Instead of a system, it speaks of the whole. Instead of mental, quote-unquote, pyramidic triplicity, it speaks of the sphere as the sphere of the present of relationships to wholeness. Beautiful. And the extended and despatialized three-valued logic of Reichenbach is yet a further indication that the purely rational conceived world must accept the indeterminate and the previously non-usable. Sucks to suck. You are no longer taking the whole and having the whole consist of 70% indeterminate, don't know, 30% you know the stuff, and just pretending that 30% is the whole. Absolute nonsense. It must also accept that by setting out to surpass itself via this very acceptance, it is destined to surpass itself in the belief that its salvation lies in an expanded rationalism based. A danger which may be countered by Weizsäcker via his quantum logic. Viewed as a whole, such inceptions of irrationality are found also in the philosophical endeavors, existential, ontological, logical, and particularly in non-Aristotelian quantum logic. The sphere is the expression of the aperspectival world. Aperspectivity is the quote-unquote volition, the awareing in truth of the whole, and consequently of its spiritual manifestation, the diaphanon, inasmuch as the whole is perceptible only as transparency, where an origin, also containing the entire future, is time-free present. To attain this consciously, without abandoning the quote-unquote earlier consciousness structures, is to overcome rationality in favor of irrationality and to break forth from mental into diaphaneity. That is the end of the philosophy section. I'm sure many of you were very excited to get there. I'm sorry it's done, but next week we have finished the philosophy of the mind section. Now we're moving on to the social sciences. So we'll get into jurisprudence. That'll be good. I love you guys. Hope you guys enjoyed listening to this. Please let me know if I'm wrong. Again, I really don't claim. It's really not important to me to be seen as like the smartest guy in the room I walk into. I think that's egotistical. And it's also just not true. I'm not saying I'm dumb by any means when it comes to this stuff, but I mean, let's call it spade a spade. Like, there are people who are more intelligent than me. It's fine. It's not a big deal. Just let me know. And next week, we will be jumping into jurisprudence, so that will be fun. I love you guys, and I will see you.